Once upon a time, a reading platform was created and stories came to life. Readers reported fearsome dragons in flight, monsters emerging from the depths, and mysterious spirits entering our world. Campfire is where you can enjoy your favorite genre fiction through an interactive reading experience right here in your web browser. Discover new reads and unlock exclusive bonus content like short stories, world lore, and character profiles as you progress through each book. You will explore faraway worlds, swoon over star-crossed lovers, and embark on epic quests, all waiting for you just beyond the page. Save stories to your bookshelf with custom collections and join a community where you'll support the authors with higher royalties than anywhere else. Create your free account and choose the genres you like to read, then cozy up with a new book. Campfire is where the stories come to life.
Hello and welcome to TBRCon 2025. My name is Adam. I'm going to be hosting this little panel on writing prologues. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to shoot them down in the chat. We will try to keep an eye on those and answer them as we are able. Why don't we go ahead and just start by introducing ourselves. We'll go through and I think just go in the order that I see everybody in the panel right now. So maybe start with Andrew and we'll kind of rotate around.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Andrew Watson. I am the author of Harbinger of Justice, which is the first book in a dark epic fantasy trilogy. Second book is coming out next month on Valentine's Day, February 14th. And that's because we all know that books are actually our true love.
Perfect. Rob?
Hi, I'm Rob J. Hayes. I'm an author of many books across many series. It's one of these, it's like whenever I would sort of like introduce yourselves, I'm like, which book shall I introduce myself? I've written 24 of them. So I'll just go with my latest. I'm the author of Herald, book one of the Age of the God Eater, part of the God Eater saga, which is dark fantasy as well. And I'm a massive fan of prologues. So I'm on that side of the discussion, just so you all know.
Perfect. Why don't we circle down and go down to Claire, and we'll move along the bottom panel.
Hi, I'm Claire Legrand. I have written many books, but the ones I am most well known for are Furyborn, which is the first in an epic YA fantasy trilogy. It's like Avatar: The Last Airbender meets Game of Thrones, but without the gratuitous violence against women. And then my other series is the Middle Mist trilogy. Book one is A Crown of Ivy and Glass. And this is like A Court of Thorns and Roses meets Bridgerton as told by the Bronte sisters. So it's got magic, it's got romance, it's got gothic, we're running across the moors in despair vibes. And I'm also a big fan of prologues. So Team Prologue.
PL, how you feel about prologues?
I'm a huge fan, and frankly, I must admit I'm a bit perplexed, frankly, about the controversy over them, and maybe we can speak about that. Maybe it's.
I think we'll speak about it, but I don't think we need to go into super detail. I'd rather focus, I guess, generally for everybody here and everybody watching. I think it's more interesting to focus on like when should you do a prologue and not are prologues good, because I think that's a very boring argument. Maybe that's a weird thing to say, but
no, not at all. Fair game. I think maybe it's because I'm old and I was a reader, like all of us. I think most of us were readers before we were writers, and I think in this social media age, perhaps things get a bit overanalyzed. Anyways, I'm the author of John Kingdom Saga, and the 4 books out now. The 5th one coming out in the spring, A Pack of Wolves. I'm definitely on Team Prologue, and I think prologues are something that, especially when they're well done, they're fabulous. So, but I must say quickly, I was getting serious FOMO with Claire holding up her books, so gonna have to put those on my TBR For sure. So
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
I'll be honest.
Ditto.
Claire held up her books, and I was like, I put these right next to me. I didn't hold them up. They didn't even mention that I was a writer.
Well, we can circle back to you. 'cause
Yeah.
Right
Well,
now we're at the end.
stick around to
Yeah.
the end to find out what I write.
yeah. Well, I quickly wanted to say before we move over that everyone's books. Here's definitely on my TBR. Now I have read Rob's books. He's a fabulous author, so I need to read more of his. So, but anyways, yep. That's my 2 cents.
Gretchen.
I'm Gretchen Felker-Martin. I'm the author of Manhunt and Cuckoo and the forthcoming Black Flame, all from Tor Nightfire. I have no special feelings about prologues in the same way that I have no special feelings about bricks or 2x4s. It's a part of a story.
They're pretty good when they're working.
Yeah. You're certainly going to notice you should have one if you need one and don't.
Hello,
And this is
Kitty.
Lenny.
Hi, Lenny.
Lenny became the star of this show.
Every
All right, perfect. So we kind of have already talked about this debate that has been going on a little bit more recently about, prologue is a good thing. A lot of people, I think, have the impression that all prologues are bad, maybe because they've read a few bad ones, or maybe they just they have the impression that it's not part of the story, so we can skip it. I don't, like I said, I don't think this argument is very interesting. I think anybody who is a writer and has spent any time with a decent prologue kind of gets that they can be a part of the story and work really well and all that kind of stuff. I think the more interesting thing to discuss is when to include one, because you don't always need one. I personally, I enjoy prologues a lot. I enjoy reading them. I enjoy writing them. I haven't published a single book with one yet, and that's just because I didn't think either of those books needed one. I know, for example, I wanted to have Claire chat about this because I know when I was looking at some of your stuff, and I think maybe a few of you have done this, but hers jumped out to me as well. You've done prologues for some of your books, and you've done none for some of the other ones. And so I think we could maybe start there and just talk about what is the thought process of making that initial decision of, do I need one or not?
It really just depends on the story. Some of my prologues have been complete, just a vibe setting, a mood setting. Some have been filling in plot gaps for the story to come. Some have been giving some insight into characters. So it really depends on the kind of story. For 2 of my 3 adult romantic fantasy books, there are prologues because I wanted to give a further insight into the character, like a peek into a crucial moment earlier in their lives that informs everything that happens next. In Furyborn, the prologue is sort of a plot linchpin. So after the prologue, during which a lot of crazy stuff happens, you then go into the rest of the story, which splits into 2 timelines, before the prologue and after the prologue. What led to the prologue and how the prologue affected things going forward. So that was just a really nice device for me to, first of all, draw people in, and then show this pivotal moment in this world's history, what came before, what came after, and have people thinking throughout the rest of the book, well, how did we get there? How did we get there at the beginning? Because that just seems so impossible based on what's happening now. So it was, it just really depends on the book, depends on what the story requires or what would enrich the story.
Yeah, and I think kind of on that note, it's really important to consider, and I think we'll get into this more a little bit later, also what your genre is typically doing. I think in science fiction and fantasy, we're a little more used to doing prologues. And, I think the audience is more receptive to that a lot of the times. I think where we see a little more pushback are things like, a romance novel, a traditional, contemporary romance, for example, where maybe you don't need that initial setup, for the setting or for the weird stuff that's going on in the world. And so that's a major consideration as well, is what are people used to, and am I playing into that or sort of subverting it? I think we'll chat about that some more later as well. Anybody else have any initial thoughts on prologues? Any advice for, like, generally when you should include one or when you maybe should avoid one?
Well, I think for me, perhaps sorry, go ahead.
No, please. Oh, thank you. I was just going to say, a great rule of thumb for me, if there are more than 2 things you really need to nail in your opening chapter, split one out and do it in the prologue. If you need a mood and a plot beat and a character beat, you can cut mood out and pop it right in the prologue, and sort of have this overlying feeling already going and cooking by the time you get to doling out plot. It's functional. It's a great way to ease people in. It's also a great way to suggest mystery.
Yeah, I think I've seen people chat about this already in the comments. Someone's brought up the Game of Thrones prologue, which obviously I think that one is a great example. Yeah, I think that one is a great example, kind of like what you're talking about, Gretchen, with like having a little bit of mystery, because we don't get into that storyline of the ice zombies like right away, but it does get our minds in that mood of like, oh, this is where we're heading. How do we get here?
Yeah, and I think, for me, and you'll indulge me, I'll be as quick about this one. Thinking this in this positive vein about prologues, if you'll indulge me, I'll quickly put up some books with my favorite prologues. And Adam already mentioned the Song of Ice and Fire. What the prologue in A Game of Thrones, the first book, does in terms of essentially outlining what will be the existential threat of the entire series. So it's really framing in some ways the entire series. Like, hey, what's really important here? All these, these wars between different factions. That's not really what, that's part of, it seems what it's a big part of the plot. And of course it is. However, what it's really about are these, approaching ice zombies. So the first book in series is Wars of Light and Shadow by Jenny Wirtz, who's my favorite author. Her magnum opus, Wars of Light and Shadow. The first book is Curse of the Mystery. And the prologue here is kind of like, not as action focused as the prologue in Game of Thrones for Song of Ice and Fire, but it really frames the entire series in terms of this is what the conflict's going to be, basically honed in on, and you can expect that will be essentially resolved by the end of the series. So that's what that prologue does. A couple of indies here. Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson. Love this series. This is the Illborn saga. The next 3 I'm going to show you very similar in that almost setting up through seeing an inciting incident and or something really shocking that makes you want to read further. Definitely part of what is foreshadowing what's to come. This is that type of prologue as well. Tim Hardy's Hall of Bones, self-published fantasy blog finalist. This one, it's basically compulsive in that you read the prologue, a character is in a really tough, scary situation. You're like, I have to find out what happens next, and it's very mysterious. You don't know exactly who the character is and what their relationship is going to be the rest of the narrative, but you feel like you really need to keep reading. So it's kind of a hook, this prologue. And finally, I believe he's in the chat, so I love embarrassing him. The wonderful Dr. Philip Chase, his Edan series, The Way of Edan, another really shocking prologue, but also one that gives some hints and some insights into the nature of the main conflict of this series. So definitely, one that really hooked me as well. So I think just some examples of prologues really done well.
I completely agree. And also, going off what PL said about it being sort of like the series rather than the book, a lot of people in chat are saying Eye of the World, which I think is another really good example, because it's also setting up the tone for the series. Because if you started Eye of the World in a small farm with this chosen boy just kind of walking about, it doesn't really give you the same tone of the overarching series. Whereas Dragonmount, a guy going crazy, killing everyone, turning into a mountain. You're like, what? And then you immediately jump to the farm. You're like, okay, how is this related? How are we going to end up there? How are we going to get to that sort of dark stage? It does a really good job of kind of setting up the tone of the series, whereas chapter 1 sets up the tone of the book.
I think for especially for epic fantasy, it's why you often find prologues in them, because epic fantasy usually has a very slow start. And I mean, to be honest, the sort of like the farm boy, farm girl trope is very widely used. And when you're doing that, yeah, you're probably going to have like a good few chapters where there's not a lot of sort of like action going on. There's not a lot of the wider conflict. It's more about, okay, setting up a bit of the world and the character that you're going to be following throughout. So being able to, especially these days, you find in epic fantasy, being able to start with the prologue that's sort of like, oh yeah, but don't worry, there is a conflict coming. It gives readers that sort of like that assurance that you're not just going to be following this person as they go about their life on the farm. Don't worry about it. Something big's coming.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that opens up a different point that I hadn't actually anticipated for some reason. The focus of a prologue could shift depending on if it's a standalone or like a duology or like a really long epic series. Like that could really shape the kind of message you're trying to send. I mean, the Game of Thrones one, for example, doesn't really pay off until like, I don't even know if the book's out yet. Maybe the 5th, like if we're stretching it a little bit. All right, cool. Well, so yeah, we're kind of talking a little bit about when do you do a prologue, when do you not do a prologue, what are some of the things you might want to do with it. I want to dig into like that point in particular, because I think one of the major things about a prologue, which I think maybe leads to people not liking them sometimes, is when they're a little bit aimless. Like, I think we need to, like, yes, introduce the world, yes, introduce the conflict, but still like ground it in stuff that we care about as a new reader. Still like ground it in the character and, give them some kind of, maybe not this book's inciting event, but like something to hook us. And so I think it's important to go into a plan when you're working on a prologue, figuring out how to approach that if you're going to do one. So like we've already talked about Game of Thrones. I think that one we've already mentioned, like the goal was to foreshadow the entire series and what the main conflict there was going to be. There's one that I personally really like by Philip Finch, a kind of contemporary military espionage thing called Devil's Keep. And that one sort of just begins with these people spreading chum in the waters, and you don't really know why, but the more you read, the more you figure it out. And then there's like this sudden realization at some point where it's like, oh no. And it's like 2/3 of the way through the book where you go back and you realize like what hell is going on, which was just like a very fun thing for me personally. A few of you have already kind of talked about some of the prologues that you really enjoy. I don't think we've heard from Gretchen yet. Do you have some examples of like some prologues that have like a really strong goal in them, where they execute it really well or something?
Yeah, I have a few off the top of my head. I really, really enjoy the prologue in the classic young adult fantasy series Sabriel by Garth Nix. I don't know if anyone else has read those, but it opens with this character as an infant, and her father goes and fetches her back from death, and that's how the story opens. And it's very simple and it's very straightforward, and it has thematic and character connection to the rest of the story, but no plot connection other than the straightforward, this character needs to be alive for the story to happen. But right away, it gives you this beautiful glimpse of the world, of the characters. And I think a tone setter like that can be such a lovely little thing. If memory serves, I think The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham also has a good little prologue that's very much just world and tone setting. I really like something that might appear, a little aimless to some readers. I'm also a big proponent of not giving readers exactly what they ask for just because they're used to it. I don't think that's a very good reason to write something. I know at the end of the day, we all need to sell books to eat, but you can't give up the whole game. You can't just be like, all right, I'll just hit all my marks and then go home. Or else you might as well just give them someone else's book.
Yeah. We got a question in the chat from Andrew. If we could have 2 events that could be a prologue, one being important to understanding how we get there and one important to the tone, which should we do in a situation like that? If I can put in my 2 cents before we open it up, I think it's really going to be something that you might want to just try both approaches and see which one you like more, see which one your beta readers or editor likes more. That may be one of those things that you just need to kind of see what happens. And anything that you don't end up using, maybe you can reuse somewhere else, so it's not going to be lost. So that's probably the approach that I would go. But also, like, if you can kind of figure out the plot event that you want to do and still also set up the world in some way, like, those things aren't mutually exclusive.
I think it's
anyone
going to depend
want to correct me,
on
jump in.
Book that you're writing. If you are writing something like, hey, this is a big epic fantasy, then chances are that having the understanding of how you got there might be more important. But if you're writing something that's, I don't know, sort of like close sort of perspective, maybe something first person, you probably want something that's more tone. I always remember the prologue to Skullswarm by Brian Staveley, which is it's entirely from the perspective of this character talking to an unknown person. And it doesn't really have much in the way of plot relevance until right at the end of the story anyway. But the voice that he uses just draws you in as a reader so well that you just you're already captivated by this character and the way that they're speaking right from the get-go. And that's very much the sort of like the tone of the book as it goes forwards. So I think what you have to do is look at the book that you are writing and sort of like weigh up, okay, which one is more important for this book, for this, the genre or the style that I'm going for.
Yeah, for sure. Like if you're writing epic fantasy, maybe the more setting and world focused thing is going to hook readers more because we love that crap. I'm also sorry it's taken me so long to get back to it, but we also had a question from Mark as well. Does I believe this was in response to like whether or not to do a prologue. Does the author decide or does the editor have input? Again, I'll open it up to the rest of you, but my belief is that the author has the final say. Your editor might make suggestions though, and you should listen to them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. At least in my experience, working with editors has been a very respectful and collaborative process. And ultimately, a good editor is there to help you realize your vision. And if there is, like Adam said, if there's something that's not quite hitting with your prologue or with the beginning of your book, an editor is really useful for bouncing ideas off of and having a discussion about, well, why isn't this working? And how do we make it achieve whatever it is that you're wanting to achieve with the beginning of the book? But otherwise, ultimately, if you want a prologue, no one's going to stop you. At least as long as nothing's wrong with it. And like actively like harming the experience of beginning the book.
Your editor's going to show up at your place and just knock on the door.
Of course, I think that the different, and of course, there's positives to all methods of publishing, traditionally publishing, and of course, independent, self-published that venue. Of course, ultimately, as an indie author, you have a bit more, creative control, and kind of as you infer, Adam, you have this final say, and that's it. There's going to be a prologue or there's not if you're an indie author. And while I think I agree with Claire that regardless of how you publish, if you have an editor, typically, you work collaboratively with them, and you're going to listen certainly to their advice and your beta readers, etc. But at the end of the day, if you, as a person who's writing the story, feels that it's integral to have a prologue, I think also you're entitled to do that. No one knows your story better than you, and of course, and maybe that's because I'm a rebellious indie author. I feel that you should write the story you want to write, and I'm not one for adhering, strictly to a lot of the so-called writing rules. If such a thing exists, I think it's all about, if you feel it's effective, and you feel that your prologue's going to work. I think your readers will definitely give you the feedback ultimately that you need to, especially, and of course, subjectively, readers either love or hate prologues in general. But if it lands, it's going to land, and you'll find out if your prologue was effective or not based on those first few reviews. I think you're going to know whether or not your prologue was meaningful.
I agree, and on that note, PL, I feel like a useful rule, not a rule, but a useful guide in any form of writing at any stage of the process, to think about your ideal reader, or in my case, I think about like my past self a lot, my younger self, or myself right now, and the kind of book I would want to read, and use that as your guide. If you think your ideal reader would pick up the book and absolutely adore the prologue, or how the prologue functions, then to me that is a good that's a good sign that you're going in the right direction. But if you think about, okay, one of my ideal readers, one of my biggest fans, if they pick this up and they think, why is this even here? This is confusing. This is off-putting. This doesn't make sense. Then that's maybe a sign to step back and reassess why the prologue is there and how you can make it more effective.
Yeah, at a basic level, if you don't know what's good or bad in your own book, you're in much more serious trouble than whether or not you want to have a prologue.
And at that point, I think, like I said, you just got to start trying stuff and seeing what works.
Yeah, you have to be confident, do something and stick with it. And if it doesn't work, you can try something else.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is to have a vision and execute it.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's what a lot of writing comes down to, is like, you're going to try a bunch of stuff, and sometimes it's going to work and sometimes it's not, and you have to go back and try other stuff. It's a very non-glamorous, answer to a lot of writing questions. Well, you just try it and see what works.
Right. 90% of writing questions boil down to, how do I write? And it's like, well, how do you build a brick wall? Get some bricks.
I also think it's worth that if your editor does bring up something like that and you're not sure, then go to beta readers, get a bunch of readers to read through it and see what their opinion is. Because an editor, I would say 98% of the time, you're just like, yep, to all the notes, or at least I am. But occasionally you come across something like super unique about how you want to do it. And if it's, really bizarre and you're trying to break a typical convention, then it's definitely worth trying this on some readers who you are expecting will pick up your book, and just seeing how they react to it as well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. So we've talked a little bit about, when do you do a prologue, when do you not? And we've talked about the importance of like having a goal as we go into them, a few examples here and there. I would like to get into, I believe all of you have written prologues in at least some of your work. We have somebody in chat who commented that they loved the prologue and Cuckoo already. So maybe we can start there and go around and just sort of share the thought process for how we decided to write those prologues, maybe in one of the examples, and what your goal in writing that prologue was.
Yeah, sure. So my prologue kind of had a bunch of different ideas that I wanted to include. And part of it was to set up that tone that we were talking about earlier, because it gets dark. It gets progressively darker, the novel. And I kind of didn't want it to be too jarring. So in the prologue, there's this guy who hears voices in his head, and he accidentally kills a bunch of people because there's this creature living in his shadow, and it's pretty dark. And then it jumps in, we get introduced to the characters, and it sets that up. And also, another reason that I wanted to do it is this character is just in the prologue, but he comes up later in the book. However, there's kind of a revelation around the same time where the main character is like, oh, I know you. And I wanted that, oh, I know you, to come from the reader as well. So I was like, okay, I need to introduce it right at the start. So they have that same, that's prologue guy. And then they have that same sort of realization at the same time.
Yeah. So for you, it was like a lot about making sure the reader understood the tone of the story they were getting into.
Yeah. And some foreshadowing and stuff like that, especially with the shadow magic. It's kind of a point of mystery in the book, and a lot of it's figuring more about it. And I really like sprinkling a little information throughout the book, and that prologue is one of those pieces of information that the reader is starting to piece together what these shadow creatures are and things like that.
Yeah,
another piece of that foreshadowing in there as well.
And for anybody who's watching who thinks that sounds really cool, what's the book's title again?
Harbinger of Justice, and the sequel's coming out next month.
Perfect. Why don't we chat with Claire? We've already talked about how you included a prologue in one of your books and not in the others. I think that one of your prologues was in Furyborn. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the process of writing that, the process of deciding like what the goal for that was?
I have many thoughts, but I will keep it brief. So this is Furyborn, the book in question, and as a reminder, it's the first in an young adult epic fantasy trilogy. And the conceit of the central conceit of the whole series is we are thrust into this climactic moment in this world's history, and then from there we split into two different storylines, one about things that happen after that event, and one about the events that led up to that event. So it serves very much it serves as very much a structural function. And it also gives us a glimpse into a couple of the key characters. And it's a really startling moment when you see this character in the prologue. And then you go into the first chapter of her storyline, and she's completely different. And you wonder, oh, what happened to this like fairly normal seeming young woman to get us to what we saw in the prologue? Basically, what I like to think of this trilogy as like kind of an Anakin Skywalker origin story, but okay. Anakin is a woman. And it's kind of like if you go directly from, oh, sweet little, or if you go directly from Darth Vader at his worst to like sweet little Anakin, and you're like, how did Anakin become, Mm-hmm. So it was very useful as a linchpin of the world, the plot, and the characters. And the scene itself, just as its own little entity, is very dramatic. It's a woman is having a baby. She's afraid of someone who is coming to perhaps hurt the baby. She sends the baby away with someone else, and that person who's supposed to save the baby, something goes terribly wrong. There's a cataclysmic event, and then boom, you're thrust into the main story, the two storylines. So I knew that I wanted to have a moment that was very emotionally like, oh my gosh, what is happening? This poor woman, this poor baby, and also serve as like how is this going to work? How are these two storylines going to intersect? And how are we going to get back to this moment? And is that moment when we get to it going to look the same, or are things going to happen that change that moment? Because there's some timey-wimey stuff going on in these books. So yeah, I love it so much. It's still one of my favorite pieces of writing because I feel like it's the kind of thing where if I picked up a book and I was thumbing through the opening pages, I'd be immediately riveted. And again, that's a big test for me as to whether or not something is working.
And if it's not working for you, then what's the point in writing it, honestly?
Right.
Like, you're the one who's going to be reading and rereading it like a dozen times at least.
Yes, absolutely.
Gretchen, we already had somebody complement the prologue and Cuckoo. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that all came together?
Yeah, absolutely. The prologue for Cuckoo was actually the last thing that I wrote for the book. I originally had a completely different kind of prologue, and my editor had a few very fair points about it being a little confusing, and I was noodling around with it, and then I had a very rare gift as a writer, which is a moment of inspiration. You don't need it to work, but it is nice when you can get it. And I had this idea that instead of focusing on all of these, the book is about a group of queer children who are sent to a conversion therapy camp in the Utah desert. And rather than opening with the children, I decided to open with one of the parents. Because ultimately, the parent's psychology, the mind of someone who would do that to their own child, rather than just deal with that young person as they are, is really important. You have to understand that people who profess to love all the characters you're about to meet have made the decision to have them professionally tortured. And so I put the reader into the mind of this really deeply unhappy and unwell born-again Christian mother who has sent her daughter off to conversion therapy camp. And early on in the chapter, her daughter returns, and she's, beyond reformed. She's perfect. And instead of being overjoyed, she is disgusted and upset. Because, of course, ultimately, when you would do this to your own child, it's because you hate them on a fundamental level. And your own power over them is the only way that you can understand the relationship you have. So the whole chapter serves a dual purpose. First, you understand what is happening in the minds of these parents who are so extremely warped and consumed by loathing for their own children. And second, it starts to turn the key to let people know what they're afraid of here, what's happening. And so when the body snatching stuff starts popping off, it should feel inevitable in hindsight.
And that's
So it's,
cozy fantasy
mood.
or like something light like that, or
I know. I feel like the odd ornament on the Christmas tree here. Everyone else is like, yeah, epic journeys and stuff, and I'm like, yeah, cool. I totally do that too.
Yeah. Well, no, I love that. Like, I guess this opens up an interesting line of question we can maybe explore later when we get more into genre and stuff. But like, we're already seeing how like the goals and the focus of these prologues are changing based on the genre and everything, which I think is awesome. Was there anything else about that prologue that you wanted to share? I think I kind of cut you off a little bit on accident.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say, relevant to your current point too, horror is a body genre.
Mm-hmm.
You want a physical reaction from your reader in the same way that you want that reaction in romance or erotica or pornography, or on a roller coaster. And in this case, the emotions you want are disgust, fear, outrage. And so you start pushing buttons and establishing that baseline. So when they get into the story proper, they're already primed to feel those things, even if the next segment might not have established everything that would make them feel it yet.
Yeah, perfect.
That's brilliant. I could listen to Gretchen talk all day.
Yeah, honestly.
Yeah, me too.
All right, well, why don't we jump over to PL? I know you've got a prologue in your series. Oh, and in case anyone missed it, Gretchen was talking about her book, Cuckoo. Go check that out. PL, you've got a prologue, I believe, in your Drowned Kingdom series. You want to chat about that with us?
Yeah, thanks. There's prologues in actually all 4 books. They all serve different purposes. And again, when I go back to that, hey, if it works and it works for that particular book, and it can serve different purposes in different books, it just depends. And I want to also give a quick shout out to Timothy Wolf. Thank you for saying. He said in the chat there that Alliance Pride, which is the fourth book and the book that's out now, has an excellent prologue. So thank you, Timothy, for saying that. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I use prologues in different ways for different books. Let's specifically talk about Alliance Pride. So the reason I put a prologue there is that there's actually a character who, in the beginning of the series, you weren't quite sure if they survived. You weren't quite sure whether or not, you weren't quite sure of their motivations, or what some of why they did the things that they did. And then you get to learn a lot more about this character, and essentially that if they are alive, it would set up, anyone who's read the series would know that this is setting up a much bigger conflict to come. So you're foreshadowing a bigger conflict if this character is alive, and you're also, the impact on the main character would be considerable if this character was alive. So, and you get to kind of see what this character could have been up to in the meantime, and how that would also affect the overarching plot of the series. So in my case, yeah, I used the prologue in Alliance Pride to really, not only foreshadow, but build up that tension, and really, again, frame the future narrative of that book and the overarching series. Definitely a prelude for what's to come. And then I kind of bookended that prologue with the last chapter, which serves almost like an epilogue but it's still like chapter, the ending chapter. It's not the afterward, etc. It is about, it's tied into the prologue as part of the overall story. So I that's the way I used it in that particular book. But in other books, for example, the first book in The Drowned Kingdom, that was definitely framing the entire series. And I believe I write essentially circular plots. I love them. I love when things kind of come all the way back around and kind of give you that payoff. So in The Drowned Kingdom, I believe when I finish writing the series, it's 7 books for now. I'm publishing the 5th shortly. I believe if people look back to the prologue in The Drowned Kingdom, the first book, when they read the 7th book, the final concluding book, they'll say, I get it. You were setting things up in that prologue at that very first book to the events that happen in the concluding book. So that's how I use prologues.
I am curious on that point, especially with A Drowned Kingdom, how you are setting up this 7-book series that isn't complete yet. I believe you got 4 of the books out so far. How do you approach writing something and publishing something that has a prologue with such a long timeline on it? Like, are there considerations that you take in, like, trying to make it still very relatable to the current book that it's in? Or, like, are you comfortable just sort of letting it go and it's like people will get it in time?
Well, I think for me, and I'll just say that, I won't say it clearly or obviously, but I do sprinkle a lot throughout the series that is, somewhat of a linchpin back to that prologue. So, if you follow the breadcrumbs through the entire series, from the prologue all the way to the final book, you'll be able to look back and say, oh, okay, the prologue was where I saw a potential outcome for the series. But if I read throughout the following books, now that looking back in hindsight, I can see, oh, well, this was a hint tied to the prologue about what would happen in the end. This was a hint. So it's not just exclusively, you read the prologue, that's kind of a hint towards what happens at the end, and then throughout the rest of the books before the last book, you get no further clues or foreshadowing. So there's definitely like a tie, right? And of course you try and disguise it to a certain degree so that the reader can't figure everything out at once. However, you do leave, as I said, those breadcrumbs, so that, especially in retrospect, when you look back, if you complete the entire series, I get it. So
yeah. So if I can kind of summarize that to an extent, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like when you're trying to create a prologue for an entire long series like you're writing, you do want to hint at the stuff that's going to be coming in book 7, but also in book 5 and 4 and 2, and have enough in book 1 where you can see how it all connects still.
Yeah, no, you said no, exactly. You summarized that exactly, Adam. Thank you.
Cool. So that is the Drowned Kingdom, Alliance Pride. Check out PL's books as well. Rob.
Yes. So I have a couple of examples to talk about. So I love prologues. I put them in most of my books, but so
I will say we do have somebody in chat quoting your work.
Yeah, I was actually going to get to the prologue of Never Die.
Perfect.
That one, I literally included that one as just a 2-line hook. So people they open the book and they see this prologue, which is literally 2 lines. It's 14 words or 13 words long, I think. And Incredible. It's just designed as a hook to immediately grab attention, make people go, huh, what the hell? I need to read the next of it now. Hang on. And I'm guessing it's worked pretty well. A lot of people seem to throw that one back at me going, best prologue. And I'm like, okay.
I think that almost appeals as well to one other thing we haven't actually touched on too much is prologues should probably be short. We're trying to get people's attention, get them in quick.
They don't have to be short at all. They can be short. They can be long. They're essentially.
Oh yeah. No, it's not a rule so much as I think there is probably some benefit to it being short. But obviously, if it doesn't work short,
situational.
Yeah.
But I mean,
sorry, I'm distracting you. Go ahead and tell us about
the other one I wanted to talk about was actually the prologue that I used in Titan Hoppers, which is my sort of young adult epic fantasy set in space. And the reason I did a prologue with that one was for the simple fact of the first chapter that I wanted to have, which is it's set in this world where humanity has survived on this fleet of crumbling spaceships that are half derelict, and they're orbiting these huge space titans, which they have to go and hop over to and scavenge supplies to live. And the first chapter I already knew that first chapter. I wanted the space, the Titan that these people, this fleet are orbiting, explodes, and the main character essentially watches his sister die as she's on the Titan. But then the actual book doesn't. The plot of the actual book doesn't start for another 5 years after that. So that first chapter that I really wanted to have, it just didn't fit in the timeline to have that as chapter 1. So I had to make it a prologue, basically, if I wanted to start it with that chapter. Which, that sort of ties into when is the right place to have a prologue. And for me, that was definitely the right place because otherwise it just wouldn't have fit in the timeline. And then as that series has gone on, I've used the prologues to do things like in book 2, I used the prologue to introduce a new character who then the rest of the characters don't actually meet until pretty much the end of the book. So I used it as a sort of you get a cold open in a TV show where they'll have the first 5 minutes before the credits. Here's this weird scene with a character that you've never met before, but then as the episode progresses, it becomes oh, that's why you sort of you're introduced to that character early on. And then again in the third book, I did it in a way because when book 2 ends, there's then a scene after book 2, which I wanted to have in book 3. But then the rest of the plot in book 3 is 6 months on. So for timeline purposes, again, I just had to have this prologue where it was okay, this is right after book 2, but then the rest of book 3 is now 6 months later. Mm-hmm. So again, it was just this case of it didn't fit in the timeline for the book. So I had to use it as a prologue instead.
That makes sense. Awesome. Thank you everybody for sharing that. I think I want to jump from here, and we've all been kind of talking about individual examples and our own examples of stuff. I would like to talk a little more broadly about how genre can affect the way that we write our prologues. And we've already seen a little bit of that, I think. Maybe we can start in general. I think a lot of people here are science fiction, fantasy, horror authors. Some of us a little on the lighter scale and a little more on the darker side. And so maybe we can talk about that divide a little bit where, how do we approach writing a prologue, and maybe setting that tone, for example, of a lighter epic fantasy versus like a grimdark something.
I would say the one big pro to having a prologue over just a chapter 1 is that buffer. When people pick up a book and they open chapter 1, you assume you're following the main character, you're in the same, this is going to be the main narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you have a prologue, you do have that buffer.
Like this could be a throwaway character. Exactly,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or a different time.
Yep.
Or even like
or someone we meet later.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing about fantasy and sci-fi in particular is that we have so much lore, and like 1,000 years ago, these 3 people found the magic sword. And it's like, but 1,000 years ago, it's not particularly related to this right now. So having that sort of buffer and being able to show that without people thinking that's going to be what the story's about, just being able to call it a prologue just kind of gives a reader that, oh, okay, so this is not quite, it's going to affect the narrative, but not directly where we're going to start the narrative.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's one thing with fantasy and sci-fi in particular. And I think, I assume horror and things would also work into that, because you can have kind of, I think you said this, Adam, in your notes about like the haunted house, why it's haunted and things like that. So other genres can do it as well. It's just with fantasy and sci-fi, there is so much lore and world building that it's really good to have that buffer to set things up.
Yeah, for sure. Anybody have any thoughts on maybe how we set those things up if we're writing a dark, like a lighter fantasy, like a cozy fantasy maybe, or something more like a classic epic fantasy versus something a little more darker? Like I know like Andrew and Rob, you guys write darker stuff. BL, I think yours leans a little bit lighter. If we're just, and Claire,
I don't know. Other people say the opposite. They call it moral grimdark essentially, but
fair. But yeah, I mean, you guys are all kind of doing a little bit different stuff. Like Claire, you're weaving in romance into all of it, and Gretchen, you've got this horror element. So like, how does that genre affect the approach and the tone that you're trying to set?
Well, I feel in horror, tone is all important. How the reader feels is the entire goal, like I was saying earlier. I think that in a prologue, you have a wonderful chance to put out a lot of extremely disposable bodies. And you can and should make them interesting and 3-dimensional and, someone that the reader would like to follow. And that makes it so much more rewarding when you sort of rip the rug out. But ultimately, it's all about tone. It's all about letting the reader know what they're in for and what the stakes are going to be and how fundamentally unsafe and frightening your world is. An epic fantasy book has a lot of concerns with constructed history and language and culture, and many horror novels are totally free from this, and you can go right for the throat. So it's a much more direct approach.
I did want to mention, though, if that's okay, just quickly, and I refer back to some of the books I held up, and I'm going to specifically talk about Illborn and The Way of Eden. And I want to pick up on what Gretchen mentioned. One thing I will say is in the dark fantasy, which there are some ties to horror. There are some similarities.
Absolutely.
So, and I think I can't remember, and I apologize. It might have been, if it was Gretchen or Rob, talking about specifically about body count and like overall, and I think Gretchen talked about disposable characters that aren't necessarily going to play a major role in the narrative. Those 2 books in particular, they do that, right? People die, and they may or may not be seen again, but however, their death is important to the narrative, and there is an element of essentially, I would arguably say, and I leave those up to the authors to speak to intent, like a horror almost feeling or vibe from the way it goes down. Because in fantasy, sometimes we have scary monsters, and we have sometimes the darkness within the humans in the story is you get akin to that horror vibe because of, and Gretchen spoke on her books about the darkness, a lot of it, the monsters are the humans that are committing these atrocities against their own family in some cases. So and you can also get that potentially in a dark fantasy book, where I know Rob writes great stuff about the darkness inside of us and what people are capable of. So yeah, I think there's potentially, it works for dark fantasy as well.
Yeah, totally. There was a great tweet a couple of years ago that was like the best kind of what was it? The best kind of fantasy is horror, but the guy has a sword. I think about that a lot.
I love that.
That's like Conan, George R.R. Martin, Elric. Those are all deeply, deeply informed, not just by like horror as a vibe, but very specifically by a lot of famous horror media.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of sticking with this just a little bit longer here. I do want to get Claire's thoughts as well, because you do sort of bring in that romance angle into your work. You are also foreshadowing character development and foreshadowing things that are happening in the world and explaining what some of this is. But how do you also kind of combine that with the relationships that are going to be coming later, or the ones that are already existing?
So with my romantic fantasy trilogy, the first book, A Crown of Ivy and Glass, which I'm going to hold up again because I love the cover.
It's very nice.
The first book actually doesn't have a prologue, and I wish I had written a prologue for it, because the main character in that first book is very, I hate this word, but she's very unlikable. she's my tribute to like Emma Woodhouse and Amy March, who are just these, exactly. Thank you, Gretchen. And I think, and she was quite polarizing for readers. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. But I think if I had used a prologue as a tool to show a particular moment from her past, when she was a child, from her perspective, I think it would have helped people understand her more quickly, and maybe provided an access point into her admittedly kind of difficult character. And I ended up doing prologues for books 2 and 3. Book 3 is not out yet, but book 2 is A Song of Ash and Moonlight, also very pretty. And both of those prologues tell the story of a pivotal moment in that character's life. For me, in my experience in romance thus far, which is limited compared to my experience with fantasy, but the really important thing about these prologues is providing, like I said before, an emotional access point to like the emotional core of the story. We, much like Gretchen said, romance as a genre is of the body, right? You want people to feel the romance, you want people to feel the attraction, you want people to feel the emotions of these characters, you want people to feel it needs to be very immediate, this emotional experience for the reader. And my prologues offer a way to get into the emotional core of these characters at pivotal moments in their lives. And I found it very useful for books 2 and 3. Really, really wish, again, I had done it for book 1. But so that's my experience with the romance genre side of things. And I also want to Gretchen's point about tone setting. In my opinion, tone setting is the most important thing here when it comes to prologues. Yes, it's nice to establish character stuff, plot stuff, world stuff. But it's about that sense of establishing expectations, right? About what you're getting yourself into. And I think tone is just so effective at conveying that. So regardless of genre, I feel like all the prologues I've written, fantasy, horror, romance, and like contemporary children's fiction, have all been essential in setting the tone for what's to come.
Yeah, I think that might be the big thing to take away from this part of the discussion is like, no matter what genre you're writing, figure out what the tone you're trying to hit is and go for it. Whether or not it's in the prologue, the first thing that people read, it needs to be in there. So yeah, for anyone who, bless you. For anybody who might be writing your own prologues in the chat, watching later, definitely something to consider there.
I would suggest writing your own prologues in a book rather than the chat.
Yeah. I mean, you can get those nice little like 2-sentence ones in though. Okay, so I do also want to chat about something that I think people sometimes believe about prologues or accidentally do in them when they're trying to set those expectations, trying to build that world for readers. And that is explaining what's going on and what the world is, but maybe, info dumping a little too much, which basically is, this is maybe a bad example because it's a show, not a book, but the Shadow and Bone series on Netflix, very first episode, I think is a great example of info dumping because all they do is explain to you what is happening for 40 minutes. And then it evens out and you get the actual story. But that's kind of what can happen sometimes, I think, when you are in that mode of I need to explain to the reader what's going on, is that feeling I need to explain everything. And I don't think that's the case. There's a balance to be struck somewhere in there.
Yeah, there's a tremendous need for economy of information.
Yep.
Take romance, for example. This I don't write romance, but I have read a fair amount of it, both classical and contemporary. And this is a genre that a lot of people see as very straightforward, and it's been devalued because of its gender associations. This is a tremendously technically complicated thing to write. Not only do you need to constantly nail tone, scene after scene, in a way that you can really play a lot faster and looser with in many, many other genres, but you need to, like Claire says, provide us emotional access points to people who still need to be interesting. You can't just show us two good people and be like, yeah, they're in love now, and in 6 chapters they're going to have sex, and then they'll have a fight, and then they'll get married. There is an emotional language that you need to follow and vary within. And if you don't have a good nose for that kind of thing, it can be really hard, to see someone doing it, and certainly to do it for yourself. Anyone who's ever read, Pride and Prejudice can tell you that marriage and romantic love are tremendously complicated propositions because they invoke things like class, economics, generational relationships, self-image. Everything that is external in a genre like high fantasy is internal in romance. And because we don't value that language as much as we do other languages, there are fewer people who can do it well. So I think knowing the conventions and the needs of your genre are very important moving in.
Yeah. I think as well though too, because as we all are aware, I may read a fantasy book that is considered fantasy romance, marketed that way, the author intentionally has written it that way. Or I can read a fantasy book that has elements of romance within it, like embedded within it. And I can read a fantasy book that is written about a specific romance, or the romance that specific romance is essentially almost like an inciting incident, or it's at the nexus of the plot. But I totally concur with what Gretchen is saying, is that, do I really care as long as it's done well? Probably not, right? Because and I totally agree with, like, writing romance is hard. It's also harder, frankly, like we all, that here we go back to these writing convention and rules when they say write what you know, etc. Well, if you haven't had a lot of romantic relationships, it may affect potentially, you may be able to write it really well because of, you've seen or been close to romantic relationships, whether it's your parents or your brother, mother, brother, sister, cat, etc., whatever. However, I think that those who have had a certain level of experience with relationships, frankly, they bring a certain level of gravitas to writing, those types of stories. So, yeah. But I think at the end of the day, like anything else, we're going back to prologues here. As long as it's written well, yep, no one's going to care that you write it, right? And if you dabble in romance, in your fantasy story, your science fiction story, your horror story, as long as it's written well, it seems authentic, it seems believable, you're drawn in and captivated by this romance, you care about the characters, you care about what happens in their romance, then everybody's going to be happy, right? So,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say really quickly, I think that also honestly applies to info dumping. Some info dumping can be great and useful. And
yes.
Sorry. Thank you. But yeah, I think in the example, Adam, that you pointed out, I haven't watched Shadow and Bone, but I can see how that particular instance might be frustrating of too much info dumping. Maybe maybe some viewers really like that. I don't know. But I think info dumping can actually be, just like anything else, can be really effective, can be really good, can be really entertaining. It's just a matter of execution. So I think even info dumping, which is like a scary phrase to a lot of writers, like, don't let that stop you from trying it out. Maybe it'll work in your particular situation.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely. People are afraid of dispensing a lot of information in a prologue. And to an extent, I see the point. You have not yet established characters in a way that can make that kind of exposition more interesting and grounded. But you can still pull it off. I don't know if anyone here reads the comic Kill 6 Billion Demons by Tom Bloom. But there's this scene...
but I want to now.
It's
after
so
hearing
good,
that title.
It's so good. There's a scene maybe 15 pages in, very, very much within the first tiny little chunk of this enormous story, where the action just stops absolutely stone cold dead, so that this really, really punishingly unfun character can give you a history lesson. And because it's so perfect coming from this like joyless curmudgeon, it adds this whole layer of flavor to it. And then he has another character come in and start arguing with her and talking about her version of history. And you get this sense, not that you're being exposited to, but that you're witnessing an argument between idiots that nonetheless contains sort of the entirety of what people's worldviews are in this place. And that's so alive and exciting, and you can do that kind of thing in a prologue if you're confident and skilled.
Yeah. And I sorry, go ahead. I just want to say quickly though, I did watch Shadow and Bone with my wife, and I remember sitting there watching that particular prologue. And I think, again, if it works, it doesn't matter, because for some people who are not raving fans of that particular author and the universe created, and they're being introduced to the series for the first time, they have no context other than, okay, this is based on a really popular series, and it's an adaptation. And for some people, and I talked to some of my friends, they loved the prologue because it basically told them what was going on. And for people who were already fans of this, they hated it because why are you spending an entire prologue dumping all this information that I already know? So it was very personal, as if because, for all of us, it's everything's subjective. So they were feeling like, okay, well, as a diehard fan of this series, I don't need all that information. You're wasting my time. You could have spent it more on giving us more of the story itself, your version of it, your adaptation of it. But for someone coming in new, some people were like, okay, well, that's great to know. So the point is, it's not going to work for everybody, but I think sometimes as long as it works to a certain degree, perhaps it's effective. I mean, I guess the difference is, I guess ratings will tell you, how well, because it may not.
Ratings will tell you how viewers reacted. They won't tell you if it was good or not.
No, that's true.
People love Marvel movies. They're terrible.
Hey, there's at least 2 good Marvel movies out of 60 or whatever there are now.
Yeah, all right. I'll buy that.
I actually think Gretchen's completely right in you can do it well if you nail the tone for it. So I mean, a lot of the arguments against prologues, especially when it comes to fantasy, are that they're dry info dumps. That's all they are. They're just like, oh yes, here's a history lesson about 1,000 years ago. And I guess for a lot of them, they are quite dry. But then you look at someone like Pratchett, who fairly regularly in his books delivers an info dump at the beginning, but he does it in such a tone and such a voice that it just engages you so that he can get away with it. So yeah, it's largely about how well you execute it. And if you deliver your information with the right tone, the right voice, you can get away with just about anything.
You can even do it totally straightforwardly and seriously. Like the best example I can think of, Peter Jackson added a 17-minute prologue to Lord of the Rings, and the studio fought him to the last man on it. They did not want it. They wanted 2 minutes of voiceover, and that was it. And he said, no, screw you. I'm going to put this gigantic prologue here that's like a tiny little movie. And it's perfect. Everyone loves it because it's visually extraordinary, because Cate Blanchett can read the hell out of that weird dialogue. And because it has like a tiny little emotional arc that it runs through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even what's done with Star Wars, with the Star Wars movies, the original set, with that rolling, coming out the Empire, like I visually, it was fantastic. And it framed what the story was about. It worked. Right. Yep. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess a better approach to this discussion is more not how to avoid info dumps, but how to, when you do them in a way that makes sense for that story, whether it be, that dry character explaining something to somebody else, or making sense within the tone, or, something that I think character is really important here. Like they are interacting with the world in some way and engaging with it. And we are observing how that happens. And sometimes it is just straight up like, this is the way the thing is, like somewhere in the middle of all that. I haven't heard from Andrew on the topic of info dumping, explaining information like this in a prologue.
Just what they all said, to be honest. I agree. Thumbs up. No, I do think the big difference between interesting lore and info dumping is just the delivery. It's how you get the information across. I mean, if you have in a fantasy book a party and they're skirting the edge of a country, and then the person at the front says, "Did you know?" and then they go through the entire history of the country, it can be pretty boring. But if they're going through a checkpoint at the edge of the country and then they see firsthand some of the remnants of past events, or one of the characters is directly connected to the past somehow, it just makes it way more interesting if it's tied to the characters and the narrative and the plot, rather than just throwing down a wiki article on the history of whatever.
Awesome. So I think we're getting toward the end at this point. I want to go through and have everybody give closing thoughts about advice you would give to somebody who is writing, whether it's their first prologue or their 10th or whatever they're working on at the moment. And also, anybody in chat, if you have questions, now is the last chance to ask them. I'll try to keep an eye on that and bring them up as I'm able to do so. So maybe we start with Rob this time. Any final thoughts on prologues, whether it's like writing them or like a specific aspect of what you're trying to do with the prologue?
I mean, when it comes to aspects of what you want to do, I would say if you're going to write a prologue, have an idea of what you want it to say as you're going in. You know, go in with your plan, with your idea, and then especially if you're writing like your first book, or you feel like I'm exploring and I think I need a prologue. Just try it. And then so much of writing is the exploration, and it's like any skill. So just try and see how it goes, and see if the prologue does actually work or not. But yeah, go in with a plan. Certainly, don't just be like, aha, this book's going to have a prologue, because then you end up with Never Die, and nobody likes that one.
Awesome, thank you. Why don't we skip over to Andrew? Do you have any final thoughts on, like I said before, like any final advice on prologues? Anything that you would tell someone who's working on theirs, or maybe you've taken away from this conversation?
Mainly I would say all normal writing rules apply. The only concern is if someone thinks about this buffer, they think, okay, that lets me be able to info dump more info and not have to worry about how it is delivered. But there is always that. If you just take normal writing rules and it normally applies, and also show it to other readers, get beta readers, show it to your editor, get friends to read it, get not friends to read it, get your enemies to read it, get your enemies' pets to read it, just anyone who is willing to read it, get them and read it.
Yeah, and I think kind of building off that point, I think it's really important to get people to read it from across different like readerships. Like if you're writing a fantasy prologue, for example, try to get a couple of fantasy people, for sure, get your audience, but also bring in somebody who maybe hasn't tried fantasy before, or they've like only tried dark fantasy and you're writing cozy, or try to get other points of view, because even if they're not your primary audience, they might point out something that somebody else missed. Cool.
Perspective can be very valuable.
Yes, exactly. Speaking of which, Gretchen, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, happily. I think my position here has been very straightforward since the beginning. If you have a good reason to do one, do it, and then do it well. The best way you can do this is by reading extensively, in the same way that if you want to learn how to caulk a tub, you should probably watch a lot of people caulk tubs. Otherwise, you're going to screw it up.
Writing prologues,
but observation
just
will get you
like
where you want to
caulking
be.
tubs.
Observation will get you where you want to be. There's
Yeah,
really
I like
nothing
that.
fancy about it.
I like that. Yeah, I think, one of the biggest things you could probably do is like read other prologues and read in general, probably.
That is exactly what I said.
Yep.
I also think that other mediums are useful in this regard. Sometimes if you're trying to study something in books and in writing prose, it's helpful to enter that concept through another medium, like movies or games or TV shows or whatever. And so if you're wanting to really drill down to this idea of prologues and think about what works and what you like and how you could maybe apply it in your own work, I would suggest like going and seeking out some of those cold opens, like the Lord of the Rings prologue, or like the prologue in the Star Trek 2009 reboot, or like basically the prologue of The Matrix, when like Trinity is being pursued, and you get a lot of world building information in that scene, but it's also really compelling action wise. So like take notes on these cinematic prologues and then think about how you could translate those feelings and those functions to a prose setting.
Learn a lot about rhythm that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, and I'm not one to give unsolicited advice because that's just me. But if you ask me, I'll give you advice. But
we're here.
but you ask. So as long as the damn thing does something, it's like anything else. We're writers. We write with intention. Almost everything we do when we're writing a book, there is an intention behind it. So as long as your prologue does something, it doesn't matter what it does, building tension, developing characters, advancing a plot, just as long as it does something, it serves a purpose. So if it doesn't serve a purpose, don't write one. If it does, write it. That's kind of my advice.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I think that is going to wrap it up for today. Well, for this show, there's more things happening later today at TBRCon. Check those out if you're sticking around. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it so much. I hope you've come away with something, whether or not you should write that prologue, or maybe some tricks about getting the tone right or something. I appreciate you checking it out, and that's it.
Hey, thanks for moderating, Adam. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks so much for moderating.
It was
a
great
job,
a great opportunity to be here and hang out with you all. So I appreciate that too. That's the show.
Right.
I told you guys I'd end this awkwardly.
Thanks to everyone for being here.
Yeah,
This was
so
fun.
nice to meet everyone. Thank you.
Yep.
Take care.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.